In today's video, the Tacoma gets new front suspension. Welcome back everyone. I hope you guys are all staying healthy and safe. As you guys may know, in the previous video I did the unboxing of my new suspension, the Icon Stage 8 kit with the billet upper control arms, and today we're going to get started with doing the install. Now the way I'm going to split this up, I'm going to do the front and the rear. Today we will be installing the front. Essentially we will be installing the Icon billet dual adjustable upper control arms. Now I am going to leave these on the current settings they are here. Essentially once we have the truck nicely level as far as the height, that's when I'm going to adjust the settings on this. And then that way, once we have it aligned and all, we can put some Loctite on here and tighten these guys down. And then for the shocks, we are doing the Icon 2.5 series extended travel shocks. Now with these guys on the 3rd Gen Tacomas, they are going to give me about up to 2 inches of lift height. If you do have a 2nd Gen Tacoma, these guys will give you 3.5 inches of lift height up front. Now I'm anticipating that with doing this video, the install on this should take about 2 hours to 2.5 hours. Should be fairly simple, fairly straightforward. The way we're going to do this is that we are first going to install the upper control arms and then we'll do the shocks. And as you guys will see, it will be fairly simple. Just like I did the front shocks previously, we're just going to use a jack to compress the shocks and pull them out. So with basic hand tools, we should be able to get this done really quickly. If you guys aren't already, I would appreciate it. Just drop me a like below, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Now, without talking too much, let's get into pulling the wheels off and installing the new suspension kit. All right, we got the truck up on jack stands. So the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm actually gonna remove the upper control arm. The one nice thing about removing the upper control arm, we'll be able to completely drop everything down and just pull the shock out, so that way we will not have to mess with the lower control arm. First thing I'm going to do is remove this 10mm bolt right here for the little ABS bracket, and then we're also going to remove this bracket right here for the brake line. So let's do that real quick. Again, first up, take this guy off right here, off the control arm. And don't lose this bolt. We're going to reuse this to reattach this bracket to the new billet upper control arm from Icon. And also take off this little bolt right here. Once that bolt's up, we're just gonna pry this little bracket to the side, like so. Just move it out of the way a little bit. Next up, we're going to disconnect the end link right here. So let's remove the 17mm bolt. Now, one thing to keep in mind, if you are just using like a wrench or socket on this and this starts spinning, just apply some pressure right here like so, using a pry bar or like a socket, and this will zip right off. Once we have this guy off, I'm just gonna put this on here and just tap it out. There we go. Okay, next up what we're gonna do is we're actually gonna disconnect the upper control arm from the spindle right here. To do that, we just have to pull this cotter pin, remove the nut, and it'll just drop down. Before we do that, I'm going to put a jack underneath the whole assembly here to hold it up. We'll pull the cotter pin out. We'll just loosen this nut a little bit, then we'll break this free and then pull the nut. And then after that, we'll be ready to remove these 2 bolts up here. All right, as you guys can see, we have the floor jack in place. Next up, we're going to remove this little cotter pin right here and then just loosen this nut. To pull this cotter pin out, I'm just going to, it's a little bit rusty, but no problem. Grab some pliers and we're just going to yank it out. There we go. Next up, we're just going to loosen this nut. Again, we're not going to take it all the way off. We just want to loosen it about halfway down. And then we need to separate the upper control arm from the spindle here. And then I'm just going to use a breaker bar here to break this loose. Next up, we want to do is separate these 2 guys right here from the upper control arm to the spindle. Generally, just grab a ball peen hammer and hit this from all sides until it separates. Unfortunately, my garage is a mess and I have lost my ball peen hammer. So I'm just going to use my breaker bar to tap this until it breaks loose. There we go. Once it's loose, we're going to remove this nut and then we'll just drop this whole assembly down. And again, we do have a floor jack underneath this to support this up. There we go. Okay, next up, we're ready to remove the control arm. All we have to do is remove this 19mm nut right here and then pull this bolt out. Before we do that, I'm gonna give myself a little bit of room. Using this little pound removal tool, we're gonna pop these little clips off right here just to get the skirt out of the way. Now that I have the skirt out of the way, I'm just gonna break this 19mm nut loose and remove it. And then before we pull this bolt out, we will have to bend this little piece right here towards us. But before we get to that, let's pull these nuts off. All right, so now that we have the nut off on the other side, we need to pull this bolt through right here. However, as you guys can see on the little chassis on the frame right here, this little sheet metal piece is going to be in the way. So what we need to do with this is bend it in towards us. Before we do that, we need to pop this clip out and this clip right here. It's essentially holding a wiring loom to the inside of the bender right here. We want to make sure we remove that so that way as we're bending this back, we don't damage the wiring harness. So let's pop these clips out real quick. There we go. And next up, as I mentioned, we need to take this piece right here and bend it back so that way when this bolt comes through, it does clear. Again, this does not do anything on the structure on the truck, so I'm just gonna grab this guy here. Also, when you are bending this back, make sure you don't grab the harness or any other hard lines back here. And just move it. All right, perfect. Let's give it a shot. Now again, we just need enough clearance for the bolt. This washer we don't have to make clearance for. And also one thing to keep in mind, you can actually see this bolt from inside the hood. So if it is getting stuck up and hung up on anything, you can look from up there and see where it's getting hung up on and see if we need to move this more or not. Okay, once we have this bolt out, I'm just gonna leave it up here. Just gonna let this guy sit up here. All right, so now we have the control arm out. Next up, we're gonna work on removing the shock right here. Essentially what we're gonna do is we're going to disconnect the sway bar right here with these two bolts right here. After that, what we'll do is we're gonna put the jack back up underneath here. We're gonna remove this bolt and then just remove our 3 bolts from the top pad, and the shock will come straight out. Throw the new shock in. Once we have the new shock in, we'll throw the new upper control arm in. Once the new upper control arm is in, we'll go through and mount the reservoir, and then we'll be done. So let's go ahead and get this out. Like I said, first up, we're gonna remove these 2 bolts right here. One thing I do wanna note, I removed my skid plate just to make it easier for the video, but you don't have to do your skid plate. For me, like I said, I just did it to make it easier for showing you guys how to do this. So let's get going with removing this bad boy. As mentioned, we're gonna go ahead and disconnect the sway bar. We just have to pop off these 2 14mm bolts. All right, next up, we're gonna move our jack back into place to support the lower control arm. Next up, we'll remove this nut right here and pull the bolt out. After that, we'll remove the 3 nuts holding the top pad on. So let's pop this off real quick. All right, next up, we're just gonna remove these 3 14mm nuts. All right, we got these nuts out. We got that nut out. I didn't pull this bottom bolt all the way through because there's so much tension on here. It's kind of hard. So once we release the tension, that bottom bolt will pop right out. All we have to do now is lower our jack slowly, and this guy should decompress and pop straight out. There we go. Now you can go ahead and remove this lower bolt. Now, one thing I do want to mention, as you guys can see, as we're putting pressure on this, it is tugging on these brake lines and the ABS line. It is recommended, and I also recommend to use a bungee to actually strap this onto your chassis so we're not stretching these guys out. Again, just like I can't find my hammer, I can't find my bungee, so we're just gonna risk it for the biscuit here. And then hold on to this guy. We will be reusing this hardware on the bottom of the shock. And then just pull this guy out. Okay, now we are ready to install the new shock. This is gonna be pretty straightforward. These are directional, so on the top it'll tell you if it's a passenger or driver. We know this is a driver. Only thing you need to keep in mind is that this nozzle needs to face out. And essentially this little reservoir will be pointed towards the front of the truck. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna throw this down into the control arm. Okay, now once we have it in place, I'm just gonna lift this lower control arm up with a jack just to kind of line these bolts up right here. And then we're gonna use these little bolts from the top into the actual coilover itself like so. So first up, let's go ahead and lift this up a little bit and then line these guys up. I'm first going to finger tighten these and then we'll tighten them down once we have all these going. So let's do that real quick. Now that I've got these finger tight, we'll go up a little bit further. Again, just finger tighten these guys down and then we'll go through and tighten these guys down. Okay, now that we have the shock in place, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go through and drive this little bottom bolt in, so we'll just line that up, drive the bottom bolt in. After that, we'll work on the control arm. Alrighty, so now we are ready to install the upper control arms onto the truck. Before we do that, I just want to show you guys how to adjust these guys. One thing I am going to do is I'm just going to install these guys as is with the current settings, and then I will do a follow-up video with adjusting these on the truck once I need to. When it comes to the settings, you can essentially move these rod ends out 2 inches, and make sure when you are doing that you're not doing it in the actual rod end here, but you are doing it right here on this section here. You essentially just loosen these guys out, slide it out, and tighten it down. One thing I am going to do right here, with these bushings, keep in mind that you guys will need to grease these every 4,000 to 5,000 miles, or just to keep it simple, every oil change. And essentially you are going to grease it here. So we're going to do that real quick. All right, now before I can grease my control arms, so essentially when you guys are greasing this, you do want to do this when the control arms are installed on the truck and you guys have your wheels on and there is pressure being applied to this. For the sake of the video, I'm just going to do it right now real quick just to show you guys. Top of the ball joint right here, it will come with this fitting, which my grease gun doesn't fit. However, it also does come with this fitting as well. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to switch out this fitting and then we'll grease these guys up real quick. Fitting off. And we'll slide this guy on. Now this kit also comes with some dust covers, which would be nice, and they also will fit over this taller fitting. Perfect, got this fitting on. Next up, let's grease these guys. Alrighty, now when we're greasing these little ball joints, we'll want to just grease it until the grease, as you guys can see, is coming down through the bottom. That's looking pretty good. And then we'll just grab a little rag, just wipe off any of the excess. And again, remember, do this once the control arms are installed on the truck, and I'm going to do that again. And once we have this completely installed and the wheels on and it's on the ground. All right, we're going to clean this guy up. Next up, we're going to throw this dust cover on. Just go ahead and throw this little O-ring on here. Throw this guy on. We're going to make sure that the icon is upright. And just use the provided hardware. Alrighty, and finally, before we can install these control arms onto the truck, we do need to add these little spacers right here. So you're going to have these little spacers and the big ones. Just keep in mind, the little guys go on the inside, longer guys go on the outside, like so. Perfect. Now that we have these spacers in place, we're ready to install the control arms onto the truck. Before I do that, I am going to pull this little sticker off the front, and then we'll use some adhesive remover to get the sticker off. Essentially, all this guy is telling us is just delta joint and which orientation it is. So I'm going to pull this guy off, and then next up, let's go ahead and throw these puppies onto the truck. Alrighty, so next up, we're just going to reinstall the control arms. Essentially, we're just going to reverse the same process of pulling these guys on, slide it into place, and then slide that long bolt all the way through. And just remember, the smaller little blocks are going to be on the inside, the longer ones will be on the outside. It is easier if you just put the inner ones in first. Once you slide it on, then put your outside ones in then. So let's get this installed real quick. Now that we have the upper control arm, we got the bolt through. Again, this is finger tight for now. What we're gonna do is we're gonna raise up the spindle using our little floor jack, align it with this, and pop this bolt through the spindle. So let's do that real quick. And then we're gonna throw the nut on that came with the upper control arm. I'm gonna go through and tighten this guy up. After this, we'll go through and tighten down the upper control arm bolts. Next up, we'll go through and reattach our brake line little bracket here to the spindle. And the same thing with up here with the ABS sensor to the control arm. Just reuse your OEM hardware. Alrighty, so before we reattach the sway bar to the truck, we first need to mount this guy right here. Now this is the bracket that's going to essentially hold our reservoir onto the chassis. The way we're going to be attaching this, we are actually going to be using the sway bar mounting locations to sandwich this plate in between. And also one thing we do need to do is we do need to move our sway bar forward a little bit, and that's where this little relocation block comes in. Now I'm not gonna shoot the whole process of doing this because it's a tight squeeze, but I'm gonna show you guys how it goes. This plate right here is essentially going to go onto the frame where the sway bar currently mounts go. So it's gonna go up first against the frame. And then what we're going to do is we're going to attach this block right here. Again, we're going to attach it in such a way that these new mounts right here will push this forward. And essentially what you're going to do is you're going to use your factory hardware to go in right here. So it's going to be flush. So like this, like that, and then attach it that way. And then these two mounts right here is where your sway bar is going to connect using the provided hardware here. It's very straightforward. So first up, what we're gonna do is we're gonna attach this block and the little bracket to the frame, and then we'll attach the sway bar to this. So I'm gonna do this real quick, and then I'll show you guys what the end result looks like. All right, there we have it. The bracket is nicely in place. As you guys can see, we have the bracket up against the frame, then a little sandwich plate, and then the sway bar is connected to that. Next up, we're gonna reattach our little end link from the sway bar, and then we'll attach a little reservoir to this bracket, and we'll be all done. At that point, we'll go through, torque all the bolts down. After about 100 miles, we'll torque everything down again, get in alignment, and we'll be good to go. Okay. All right, so next up, we need to mount our reservoir right here. Essentially on the third gens, for our first little bracket, we're gonna attach it through this guy right here and right here. So through the middle and here, and then that's gonna go on the bottom like so. And then the top will just go around here. So, and we have these two little hose clamps, nothing special about them. I'm gonna throw these guys on. I might change these out in the future for something nicer, but this will do for now. So first up, I'll go ahead and do the bottom. And as we're adjusting these reservoirs, we just want to make sure that they're not rubbing up against the control arms. Go ahead and throw on the top. And again, it's going to go around the top of the bracket. Slide it on. And there we have it. Now that I'm looking at it, I probably should put these guys on the other side. We might have a little bit of clearance issues here, but once I put these on the ground, we'll see if we do. If we do, I'll switch these guys around. But this is looking pretty good. There we go, nicely tight and secure. Again, we're gonna go through and torque everything down, and then we are done with the install. And there we have it for the install. Now, I went through and torqued everything down to OEM specs. I'm gonna get the truck aligned, and then after that, about 200 or 300 miles, I'll go through and torque everything down again. Now, I am not going to be adjusting the height in this video. Essentially, once I do the rear, I'll go through and adjust the height, and I'll do a follow-up video to show you guys how to do that. Also, I will do a follow-up video and show you guys how to adjust the upper control arms. That'll be a separate video, so that way we're not making this too long. Now, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, drop me a like below. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. In the next video, we'll go through and install the rear suspension. So we'll be doing the 2.5 series shocks along with the new leaf pack from Icon. Until then, I hope you guys stay healthy and safe, and we'll see you.